savage. Whatever I want, I'm going to get. Whatever I want, I have to get.
Where we hanging out and what we doing, we can't really disclose. And we gonna go buck full crazy.
It's so difficult to reflect on the darkest times in your life. Sometimes you gotta do that. I was up.
You pick your victim. Your suffering makes you bitter. Your bitterness makes you resentful. And once you're on that road, if I can manipulate you and I can get what I want, then why the hell shouldn't I do it? If you're a psychopath, you dispense with your future self. That's why so many of them end up in prison. The persona is the mask that you wear to convince yourself and the world that you're not a terrible monster, so that when you look at yourself in the mirror, you don't have to run away screaming. Most people who are cowards disguise their cowardice as morality. If you're an axe murderer but you don't have an axe, that doesn't mean that you're moral. Machiavelli gave advices to princes who wanted to maintain their position by hook or by crook, let's say. So Machiavellians are willing to use manipulation to obtain their personal ends. The Machiavellian would be manipulating the conversation constantly to get an edge, to get an angle. A Machiavellian doesn't use their words to represent what they believe to be true. They use their words to obtain whatever they're angling for from the person they're talking to. That happens on the sexual front, for example, very often. So people who are hyper-committed to short-term mating strategies tend to use instrumental language, right? They're manipulative.
I don't know if guys have noticed this, like a lot of ladies drink water at parties. They just, so you have, if you don't have what they need, they're gonna leave.
Right.
Gotta keep them there.
Right.
You need locks on the doors.
Psychopaths seem to be something approximating parasitical predators. And so they're very, very low in agreeableness, and that makes them callous and non-empathetic. And then they also seem to be very low in conscientiousness. A real psychopath is someone who is willing to take what you have, let's say, and use it, and that might be the predatory aspect, and also to live off the earnings and efforts of others, and that's also an element of criminal behavior. If you're psychopathic, you're much more likely, for example, to be a repeat offender. If I'm a psychopath, whatever's yours is rightfully mine, and if you can't defend yourself against me taking it, that's just an indication of the kind of weakness that makes you a viable moral target, right? You're too weak to resist, you're too contemptible to even bother with. So not only can I take your stuff, but morally I'm obligated to. They're very, very low in agreeableness, no empathy, tend to be callous. That's the personality manifestation. They're very unconscientious. They will not formulate or keep verbal contract. The worldwide prevalence of psychopathy ranges between 1% and 5%, hovers around 3%. And what it seems to indicate, because it's relatively stable, is that although being a psychopath isn't a particularly successful strategy, in that 97% of people don't take that route, in a cooperative society, a niche does open up for people who are willing to use manipulation and impulsive behavior and sadism to dominate and use power oppressively to at least carve out for themselves some degree of success, and then now and then some spectacular success, I suppose, which would be the case with people who are extraordinarily successful at being tyrants. The Dark Tetrad interested me particularly because the literature I read on psychopaths did describe them as impulsive, so they're willing even to sacrifice their own futures to the pleasure of the moment. But there was obviously a subset of psychopaths who delighted in being cruel. And the standard explanation of callousness, say, which is merely lack of empathy, didn't seem to be enough, right? Because it isn't merely that people are lacking empathy. It's that sometimes there are people who take a positive delight in cruelty.
And they don't want me to throw the parties no more. But we ain't gonna stop. We're gonna keep on having fun.
The key thing for psychopaths, in our opinion, is impulsivity and sensation seeking, which is what gets them into trouble. They may not have worse motives than the others, but they can't help it. That's why they, at the extreme levels, spend their lives in prison. Whatever the temptation is, they go for it, and often they get what they want right away, and they keep on doing it until they get caught, and they don't seem to learn from it.
I'm a savage! Oh! I'm a savage! Whatever I want, I'm going to get! Whatever I want, I have to get!
Anger is a multidimensional emotion. It activates positive emotion systems and negative emotion systems simultaneously. You can think about that perhaps as the core element of something like aggression, maybe both defensive and predatory aggression. And then you could imagine that people are wired differently as individuals, so that for any given person, being angry might be associated with a predominance of approach motivation, right? Positive emotion, and a relative decrement of negative emotion. And for other people, that would be reversed. Like, I'm trying to account for what the positive pleasure is in the observation or participation in the aggression. Hypothetically, you could associate it actually with predatory behavior, with hunting and with combat, but it also might be a consequence of differential wiring at the neurological level in relationship to the balance between positive and negative emotion experienced by any given person with anger.
What you gotta say now? What you gotta say now? You ain't got shit to say.
The worst snake of all is malevolence, because one of the things that you view, for example, when you're looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, is that people encounter something malevolent and it breaks them, because it's the worst thing to understand. It's like suffering is one thing, man, that's bad enough. But to encounter someone who wishes that upon you and will work to bring it about, that's a whole different category of horrible. Especially when it also reflects something back to you about yourself. Because if someone else can do that to you and they're human, that means that you partake of the same essence. If you look at something monstrous, you have a tendency to turn into a monster. How does it possess you? That's easy. Your suffering makes you bitter. Your bitterness makes you resentful. Your resentment makes you vengeful. And once you're on that road, you go down that a little bit farther, man. We know how predators work with regards to children even. If you're a pedophilic predator and you're looking at a landscape of children, the child that you're going to go after is the one that's timid and won't fight back. You pick your victim because they're predators. They're not going to attack someone who's going to fight back. They're going to be looking for someone, one way or another, that cannot conceptualize what they are. And then, perfect, it's an open season. Yeah? The psychopathic types and the narcissistic types, they just use that to manipulate, right? They're not using it to play a finite game or to play an infinite game. Whatever information they derive from the social interaction, they just put to their own self-serving purposes, right? They're just using it to facilitate manipulation. If I can manipulate you and I can get what I want, then why the hell shouldn't I do it? Why shouldn't I lie and cheat and steal if it means I get my way? Well, that might work momentarily, but you're also playing an infinite game with yourself. And we know perfectly well that the typical outcome of the psychopathic pattern of interaction is negative for the psychopath himself. They're incapable of learning from experience, for example, so they repeat their errors. They don't modify their own behavior. And so if you're a psychopath and a narcissist and Machiavellian, you can optimize certain forms of short-term return, but it's a really bad medium to long-term game, even if you don't include other people in the purview of your moral sentiment. If you're a psychopath, you dispense with your future self. That's why so many of them end up in prison.